Welcome to this high-level side event of Amnesty International at the 48th session of the Human Rights Council. My name is Malan and I'm the editor of the Bhekisisa Center for Health Journalism in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I'll be moderating this event. This event is co-sponsored by Argentina and it will be about an hour long. We will start off with introductory remarks by our panelists and each of them will have about 6 minutes to do this. We'll then move on to a short question and answer session during which I will pose your questions to the panelists. And now we're ready to start our proceedings and a bit of background. Almost 2 years after the first cases of, and now we're ready to start our proceedings and a bit of background. Almost 2 years after the first cases of Covid-19 were identified, the experience of people around the world reflects pre-existing inequalities that have been magnified by the pandemic. We've seen inequality in the form of unequal access to personal protective equipment and COVID tests at the beginning of the pandemic, and that then later moved on to vaccine inequality. Now, as a health journalist based in a country which has only fully vaccinated 12% of its population, while European countries and the United States are well past the halfway mark and already thinking about booster doses, I see this inequality playing out around me each day. But South Africa is still in a much better position than many other African countries, because although Western countries are in front of us in the line for vaccine procurement, my country is wealthy enough to buy vaccines directly from manufacturers. Most other African countries are too poor to do so and can only access subsidized vaccines via COVAX's limited supply. So today we're going to try to address the situation where a basic human right such as access to healthcare during a pandemic is almost entirely determined by how much money a country has. We have 4 remarkable panelists from Amnesty International, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the United Nurses Association in India. In the interest of time, I'm not going to introduce the panelists now. I will introduce each panelist when they come up for their speaking turn. But let's start with opening remarks by Argentina's Health Minister, Dr. Carla Vizzotti. As I've mentioned earlier, Argentina is the co-sponsor of this event, and Dr. Vizzotti has recorded a short video. Let's have a look.
Internacional, señor Director General de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, señora Alta Comisionada de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos, señor Asesor Especial del Director General de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, señor Secretario Nacional de Trabajo de la Asociación de Enfermeras Unidas en India, distinguidos delegados y delegadas. A esta altura, todos y todas somos conscientes que la pandemia de COVID-19 constituye una crisis humanitaria sin precedentes que está impactando el núcleo de la economía en los países en desarrollo y en las poblaciones vulnerables fundamentalmente. No obstante, al mismo tiempo, es una oportunidad única y una responsabilidad compartida para iniciar una recuperación sostenible e inclusiva. Es por ello que en la Argentina hemos adoptado estrategias integrales de respuesta a la pandemia y de reactivación económica con perspectiva de género y de derechos humanos, diseñando medidas específicas para atender las necesidades y asegurar el acceso a los derechos de las mujeres, niños, niñas, adolescentes, adultos mayores, trabajadores con bajos recursos, personas con discapacidad, colectivos de la diversidad y otros grupos con derechos vulnerados. Nunca antes se había percibido como hoy la necesidad de garantizar de forma justa y equitativa el acceso a las vacunas. Sin embargo, y pese a todos los llamamientos internacionales, la grave desigualdad de la distribución de estos insumos estratégicos representa un hecho injusto y contrario a los intereses de la comunidad internacional en su conjunto. Debemos redoblar nuestros esfuerzos para identificar las vías adecuadas que posibiliten la transferencia de tecnología y el licenciamiento de los derechos de propiedad intelectual que refuercen las cadenas de producción regionales. Herramientas e iniciativas multilaterales como el acelerador ACT, el CITAP, el mecanismo COVAX, así como las iniciativas bilaterales de donación, constituyen compromisos concretos con la solidaridad internacional que hay que fortalecer y agilizar. Finalmente, invitamos a los países a levantar las barreras en el acceso y distribuir sus dosis excedentes y llamamos al sector farmacéutico a compartir la tecnología y el know-how para reforzar las cadenas de producción regionales. Como dijo nuestro presidente Alberto Fernández, de la pandemia, al igual que de la pobreza, nadie se salva solo. Nuestro compromiso es empezar con quienes más lo necesitan hasta alcanzar a todos y todas. Muchas gracias.
Who is Argentina's health minister for those opening remarks. We're now going to move on to our panel discussion and introductory remarks. And our first panelist is the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Dr. Michelle Bachelet Jeria. Dr. Bachelet Jeria was appointed to this position in 2018, and she's also a former president of Chile and also a medical doctor. Dr. Bachelet was the first director of the UN Women, and she can only join us for 30 minutes today, so we will have a short Q&A session directly after her introductory remarks. Dr. Bachelet, why is vaccine inequity a human rights issue, and what human rights issues are the most affected?
Availability in the developed and developing world. The human rights consequences of this failure are profound. At the most basic level, people are dying because they do not have access to vaccines, so their rights to life and health are at stake. But beyond that, we know that without vaccines, societies are unable to move from COVID response to recovery, economies are plunged into deeper recessions, and personal freedoms are curtailed. Our efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals are also substantially set back. I would like also to emphasize that inequality on this global scale has contributed to fragility and undermined trust. You ask what human rights are more affected. The most affected, yes, of course, but first let me say that the pandemic continues to pose an extraordinary threat to societies worldwide, both as a public health emergency, but also on the socio-economic crisis with far-reaching consequences. COVID-19 has shown that the failure to integrate human rights-based approaches into health emergency preparedness, response and recovery efforts has serious consequences for human rights and development. But it's not just a question of what rights, but of which people are most affected. One thing that we have seen throughout the pandemic, and we see it as well regarding vaccines, is that groups that have been long marginalized and by systemic discrimination and pervasive inequalities have been affected the most. So I'm particularly concerned about the impact on women and girls, older people, people living with disabilities, people from the LGBTI community, people deprived of liberty, among other groups. So as long as vaccines are not available for all, people across the world will continue to suffer a wide range of human rights impacts. For example, this crisis has had a catastrophic effect on other health services, including serious disruption to sexual and reproductive health services, treatment for non-communicable diseases, mental health care, routine vaccination, among others. So, on the other hand, low-income countries already in debt, distress, face severe fiscal limitations to respond effectively to the pandemic and its impact. So the pandemic is an assault on the right to development, exacerbating poverty and inequality within and among nations, and widening gaps in global inequalities and development. So it is estimated that delayed vaccination timelines will cost the global economy $2.3 trillion in the next 3 years.
Delayed vaccination will have an impact on economies. So what more can be done to persuade states to put human rights at the heart of their COVID-19 response?
With regard to vaccine nationalism, the path forward is clear. I've called for existing production to be expanded by all possible means. At the same time, developed countries need to stop stockpiling and start distributing. States should significantly expand support for initiatives such as the COVAX facility, and I welcome Amnesty 100-day challenge for excess doses to be contributed to a massive scale. All other obstacles of ensuring vaccines and treatment reach everyone should be eliminated, including licensing processes that are unduly complex and restrictive. How could we persuade states to take these steps? Well, I think we make crystal clear that we have the ability to save hundreds of millions of thousands of lives, and that the economic cost of failing to take these steps are much greater than the cost of global vaccine distribution now. And of course, what everybody knows, the longer we don't have people vaccinated, the more people are not vaccinated, we can have new and numerous new forms of variants that can make much more difficult the response and the recovery of the pandemic. So we need as well to make sure that the business involved live up to their human rights obligations and responsibility, and see this moment as a defining one for their work. Their quick development of the vaccines was a remarkable achievement. Yet its promise will be unrealized if the majority of the world's population cannot access the fruits of that feat. As Secretary General said yesterday, or I think it was that science worked, but solidarity was not working, it was failing. So as you and I have a role to play too, we need to make it clear to both states and businesses that this is a priority and that citizens demand not short-sighted vaccine nationalism, but a sustainable response to the pandemic that requires vaccine access for all, not sometime in the coming few years, but as soon as it can possibly be achieved. Thank you very much.
The time that you've afforded us today during a very busy schedule. Dr. Bachelet's team has just let us know that she can unfortunately not stay on for a Q&A session, so we are going to move on to our next panelists, and we're going to hear from Callamard, who is the Secretary General of Amnesty International. Dr. Callamard has also been in this position from March 2021, and she's a former Director of Global Freedom of Expression at Columbia University in New York, and was also the Executive Director of Freedom of Expression of the organization that specializes in freedom of expression, Article 19. Dr. Callamard, why is vaccine access an issue for Amnesty International, and what have you done so far?
Thank you very much, Mia, for the opportunity to speak about an issue that is very close to Amnesty's heart and work, and very close to mine in particular. I have listened to the Argentinian minister, I have listened to the High Commissioner, and I'm still flabbergasted that almost 2 years into that pandemic, we have to argue that the absence of a global approach to vaccine redistribution is a major impediment to global recovery. It is a major impediment to economic recovery, and it is costing the lives of thousands, and indeed it has costed the life of 4.5 million people. People have been pushed to the very edge of their capacity to survive, and those who did not survive were in vast majority elderly, blacks, ethnic minorities, frontline workers, and the poor. As you, the previous speakers have highlighted, and you, Mia, as well, the pandemic has not only magnified the world's problem, it has thrown a harsh spotlight on our inability to work together to respond to it. Many of those deaths, not all, but many of those deaths, particularly now, are preventable through access to vaccine, and yet people are dying in front of our very eyes. The international community has put in place mechanisms, COVAX, CPAT, and yet those mechanisms have been left powerless. COVAX in particular does not have sufficient vaccine to redistribute. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies have refused to share their knowledge and technology to expand global vaccine supply. So we are in the second year of COVID-19, and yet the pandemic is far from being over. Scandalous levels of inequality between countries, within countries, are in place globally, while pharmaceutical companies have prioritized profit over lives. And frankly, the governments of where those companies are located and beyond, the wealthier governments have been shamefully responsible for hoarding scarce supplies. We at Amnesty have calculated, along with others, that there are currently 500 million surplus vaccine sitting in stock at the end of September. We have found that Pfizer has delivered 4 times more vaccine to Norway than to all low-income countries combined. Moderna has delivered no dose at all to low-income countries. Johnson & Johnson has refused to grant a license to a Canadian pharma company that could have manufactured 20 million more doses per year. And what is the outcome of all of those things? Less than 2% of the vaccine have gone to low-income countries. Less than 10% of the population in low and lower middle-income countries are fully vaccinated, and tens of thousands of people are dying each week. So it is a human rights scandal. It is a human rights crisis. We are made the witness, but I will say even complicit. People like me, living in a rich country, fully vaccinated, complicit in what is now becoming a massive human rights violation at global scale. We are being made complicit of an international global system rendered powerless by, frankly, greed and a number of rich countries unwilling to behave responsibly while they do have the capacity to do so, while they do have the control to do so, and yet they don't.
Now, you have mentioned that there are many challenges and there are many things that we need to do. For instance, pharmaceutical companies need to transfer technology and also share their IP rights, and that governments also need to act in a way that is more supportive to vaccine equity around the world. But how do we know what the things are, but how do we get them done? What is it that needs to happen? And do you have calls on pharma as to what exactly must happen? And in addition to that, what is that we need to do to make these things happen other than just making calls?
Unbelievable. Isn't it unbelievable that in many ways we all know what is the solution? We all know that it will benefit everyone, and yet everybody seems paralyzed, and including the country that have the capacity to move things forward. In July of this year, a WHO-led task force set a target to vaccinate 40% of people by the end of 2021. To meet this goal, states and companies need to radically shift how they vaccinate and who they vaccinate, so that an additional 1.2 billion person in low and lower income countries can be vaccinated in the next 100 days. COVAX, which is the main instrument through which vaccines are allocated around the world, just announced in September that it has a 500 million shortfall of vaccines. And I've already mentioned that Western richer countries have hoarded vaccine supplies to a very large number. So what needs to be done? I mean, at Amnesty, we have been working on the issue of vaccine for more than for almost 2 years now. We have engaged into many things. We're part of of coalitions. We're trying to monitor and report on the human rights impact of vaccines. We're advocating and lobbying. We have decided to step up our effort as well. So in a week time, we will be launching a 100-day countdown, calling upon pharmaceutical companies and states to take urgent measures to reverse the scandal of global vaccine inequality, but most importantly, calling upon the people of the countries that have the power to act. It is really ultimately incumbent upon us, the privileged individuals, to take action and to say not in my name, to tell their government not in our name, you must take action to redistribute vaccines globally. What does it mean practically? We have three calls. One, pharmaceutical companies should ensure that at least 50% of COVID-19 vaccines go to low and lower income countries, preferably through international or regional distribution mechanisms. That's the first call. And we will be going after each and every one of those pharmaceutical companies with all the weight and power and commitment of the Amnesty International machinery and platform. We can't accept that pharmaceutical companies lead that process through an obsession or a sole focus on profit and greed. That's the first action. Second, we will call on government, G20 members, governments of the wealthiest countries, to redistribute the hundreds of millions of excess vaccines to lower income countries, again through international or regional distribution mechanisms. As I have mentioned, we believe that there are 500 million vaccines in surplus held by the US, the UK, the EU, Japan, Canada. There will be more over the next 100 days. We do not need these surplus vaccines. These are surplus after having vaccinated the population of those countries. They must be redistributed as a matter of emergency in order to save lives and in order to ensure that our global recovery actually takes place. At the moment, it is really such a partial recovery that is being sold, in fact, to the people. Third measures. The challenge cannot stop here. So that 2022 is the year in which we end this pandemic, we need to increase global capacity by increasing supply. And that means that the trip waivers must finally be given the full, the full okay, that states and pharmaceutical companies will take every measure to support knowledge and technology transfer efforts to local and regional manufacturers so that global supply of COVID-19 vaccine can be increased moving forward. It is in our hands. I want to insist upon that. Very rarely does the world confront massive human rights violation and find itself in a position where it knows what to do, where it has the capacity to do it, and yet does not do it. That is one example where we have the capacity to act, where we can make a big and huge difference, including on the right to lives of millions of people. We must be calling upon pharmaceutical companies and our governments to do the right thing. We need to move towards vaccine equity for the sake of the people of the low and middle income countries, but frankly, for the sake of all of us, for the sake of a multilateral system that is able to deliver for each and every one of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that call, Dr. Callamard, and three important messages there. Share excess supply, make sure that 50% of vaccines go to developing countries, and also to make sure that there is some technology transfer and also sharing of intellectual property rights to ensure developing or poorer countries to also manufacture vaccines. We have a message from the UN High Commissioner, Dr. Michelle Bachelet, Jeria, who has is supporting this 100-day challenge, and I'm going to read that to you. She says, I support Amnesty International's 100-day challenge to uphold human rights obligations to reverse global vaccine inequality, acting together as one humanity to deliver on human rights commitments will save lives, societies, and economies. Human rights must be at the front and center in any response to COVID-19 in the common interests of us all. We're now going to move on to our third panelist, who is from India. He is Jibin Theerthakkhuzhi Chalil. He is the National Working Secretary of the United Nurses Association, or UNA, in India. He's also the President of UNA's Maharashtra chapter, and UNA is India's largest union of nurses in the private healthcare sector. Mr. Chalil has been a practicing nurse since 2008 and is originally from the southern state of Kerala. Mr. Chalil, what is the current situation in India with vaccine access?
Thank you so much for giving us such a great opportunity to be part of this Amnesty program. And currently, the situation in India is not that really bad comparatively with last year, because we have suffered a lot in the beginning time of COVID-19. And we had a series of lockdowns in different part of the nation, and still some of the states in our country is having lockdown. So we have lost almost 440,000 people from our nation, and we have almost 33 million people got affected just because of COVID-19. And also we have lost thousands of health practicing nurses and doctors, also the other frontline workers, which was really paining for us. I mean, in the initial time of COVID, we were really not known how to handle it. I mean, we were in a state where things were not properly handled. We were not having adequate protective equipment. So a lot of things happened, and gradually we have lost a lot of our healthcare professionals. That was the biggest loss for the country and for the globe. And after almost a year now, we are trying to come back to the normal stage, but still there are a lot of places in India, different states are going through regional lockdowns, and a lot of things are happening in different part of India. But of course, with the help of vaccines, we are able to come back with a less number of new COVID cases. That's one positive response. I can share it with you all. Because after we started COVID-19 vaccinations, number of cases have actually reduced very drastically, and now we are into few thousands. And I think in future, if we can cover up more vaccination to the people, then definitely we will have a less number of affected people in India. So apart from this, obviously our economic system are also really affected because of this, and there are a lot of things have been really affected just because of COVID-19, as like the global nation are suffering. But I feel with the coordination with other countries and the support from other nations, definitely we also can come up to a good level, and we hope to see that in soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that response. I have one more question for you, and that is, what do you say to states that spoke fine words about global public goods but have not translated them into reality? And that, of course, plays out around you in your country.
Yeah, that was the saddest thing what we all see right now, because in the speech by the previous the spokesperson also mentioned the same thing. So there was an announcement by the global leaders or the influential countries that they are going to support for all the trip waivers and everything, but unfortunately they have not done it so far. I mean, that's the reason even countries like India are really suffering about it, because we could not manufacture the vaccine without in a higher level. If we could have manufactured it in a bigger way, definitely we could have given it to more public, and we could have controlled this pandemic in a better way. Not just India, the other countries, the lower income countries, middle income countries. So those people could have been done better than what they are right now. So I think it's not just about the global influential countries, it's about the pharmaceutical companies also. they're actually minting money out of it. If you could see their financial status of if you compare the the profitability of last year versus the current year, they must have reached multiple profitability comparably with last year, just because of this vaccines. So they do not want to share. They do not want to reduce their over profitability. That's the reason they are not, in favor with the TRIPS waiver. So this is something, an injustice to the human. This is something very, 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 very unfair to the humanity in the globe. So we believe that every country, whosoever it might be, every country should stand for the human rights, and vaccine is a human right for individual, and we are also supporting that. Hopefully, we will get through that. But at this time, we could able to only administer 4.3 million doses in a day, but we need at least 10 million doses in a day to complete the entire population in India. So imagine we need to manufacture the higher number of vaccines in the globe so that we can control this pandemic. That's all. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Chalil. We are now going to listen to a message of the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, and he can't join us in person today, but he has recorded a message in support of the 100-day vaccine challenge that was announced a bit earlier. Let's have a look.
Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, WHO is founded on the idea that health is a human right. And yet, here we are, in the middle of a pandemic, and billions of people cannot access the vaccines that could bring this global nightmare to an end. People are dying who should not be. There has been a lot of talk about vaccine equity, but too little action. High-income countries have promised to donate more than 1 billion doses, but less than 15% of those doses have been materialized. Promises to prioritize COVAX and low-income countries have not been met. The companies and countries that control the global supply of vaccines seem to think that the rest of the world should be satisfied with leftovers. We don't want excuses. We don't want promises. We want vaccines. Thank you for your support for vaccine justice. I assure of WHO's full support for the 100-day call to action for 2 billion vaccines. I thank you.
That was a message from the World Health Organization's Director General, and we're now going to move on to our questions from the audience that I will pose to the panelists. Please do enter your questions in the chat box so that we can access them and we can ask them to the panelists. We have some questions already, and the first question that I would like Dr. Callamard and both our panelists who are here to respond is, what are the most important policies that governments can take unilaterally and also within international institutions to improve global vaccine equity? This was asked by Oliver Pierce, and I would like both our panelists to give their opinion. We can start with you, Dr. Callamard.
Sorry, Mia, I was expecting Dr. Peter Singer to speak now. I think we may have overlooked him.
Dr. Singer is the Chief Advisor of the World Health Organization's Director General. Dr. Singer, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Callamard, Agnes, if I may, and Mia, and to all the panelists. It's very humbling for me to be here. I want to thank you for having me. And I want to say, first of all, how much Agnes, Callamard, your remarks resonated with me. You know, this is not only a question of equity, as we framed it, it's a question of justice, because there are many structural issues at stake. And WHO, as Dr. Tedros, my brother, said, very much welcomes a human rights approach to this problem. As he mentioned, human rights is embedded in our Constitution. It says the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is the fundamental right of every human being on the positive side. And that, of course, includes vaccination. On the negative side, as was mentioned, needless deaths, the deprivation of life, where life should continue, is the ultimate deprivation of human rights. So firstly, we very much welcome a human rights approach. Now, part of the reason we welcome it is that it's normatively and intrinsically important, but also one of the most astounding lessons of this pandemic is that the ethical arguments, the economic arguments, even the epidemiological arguments from self-interest, if we let the virus rage in parts of the world, that's a way to generate variants that could potentially escape the vaccine and come back and set us all back. So whether it's the altruistic or the self-interested arguments, the most shocking thing is those haven't been strong enough to move the needle sufficiently on vaccine equity. And so human rights approaches, in addition to that, are very, very much welcome. Now, as was mentioned, WHO's targets are for every country to vaccinate 10% of its population by the end of September, 40% by the end of the year, every country to vaccinate 40% of its population, and 70% of the world to be vaccinated by mid-2022. That does require the 40% target, 2 billion doses. And if you can imagine, 70% of high-income countries have already met that target, the 40% target, but 0% of low-income countries. It's estimated that meeting that 40% target in the next few months could save 1 million lives. Let me just pause there. Imagine having the power to take a decision that could save 1 million lives. And this is in the context of which the booster debate is occurring, where the evidence is not yet fully compelling, although it's likely at some point that it will be, but the ethics are terrible in terms of allocation issues. So what can be done? Well, I think it's fantastic that in the call to action that was launched by Amnesty, there are a couple of measures on essentially vaccine reallocation and redistribution, which is needed immediately to save lives. And there's also a focus on sharing, waiving intellectual property, sharing technology, sharing know-how. It's about sharing the recipe and about sharing the chefs to ensure at least regional vaccine security and regional vaccine manufacturing. And this spectrum, because that's the sustainable solution, this spectrum is very important. Mia, you asked one of the questions that Oliver Pierce asked in the chat, and I'll deal with the international organizations part of that. He asked, what can governments and international organizations do? Well, WHO has launched a wide spectrum of initiatives. Perhaps the most important thing, actually, and I'm a little biased, is the moral clarity with which Dr. Tedros has addressed the vaccine equity and vaccine justice issue right from the beginning of the pandemic. And I think that leadership has been extremely important. We've launched CTAP, which is about voluntary licensing. We've launched with partners ACT-A and the COVAX facility that has been mentioned, and also the WHO South Africa mRNA hub for technology transfer, and then broader initiatives like the Berlin Hub on pandemic preparedness, other preparedness initiatives. The primary healthcare programs we support in countries are integral to this, as is WHO's 152 country offices and its governance platform of 194 countries, because inclusive governance is so important. So in closing, what I'd like to say is I'd like to echo my brother, Dr. Tedros, to say that WHO fully supports Amnesty's 100-day campaign. We're very, very glad that that you're doing it. And this is really some very powerful but perhaps justified language was used, like scandal, It's a very, very powerful campaign. And this is a challenge that, as Agnes Callamard said, we must work together. We must work together to meet. You know, in a sense, the world has passed the test of science with flying colors with the development of these vaccines. But unfortunately, so far, we're failing the test of humanity. Again, it's a great pleasure to be with you. This is something we can do something about, especially young people. And that's why Amnesty's network is so important, inspiring folks to this cause of vaccine justice. And very much look forward to your further questions and comments. And thank you very much again for the invitation.
Dr. Singer, thanks so much for your remarks and for your insight and for also answering a question so long. I have one last question for you. Could you give us a short overview of the successes and failures of COVAX and the lessons for future pandemic response?
Very important facility. And of course, it's a partnership of WHO and Gavi, CEPI, UNICEF, a number of groups is nested within the ACT-A accelerator because you need not only vaccines, but also therapeutics, oxygen, diagnostics. You know, it had a goal of accelerating vaccine production through orders on the procurement side. I think that goal was an important goal, was to a degree met. And it has obviously a role of redistributing, essentially distributing vaccines, allocating vaccines so that they go to the people at the highest risk. You know, I was really taken by the stories of the health workers in India who've died, and we see those terrible, sad stories all around the world. Those are the people at high risk we're talking about, who expose themselves to take care of their neighbors. They take on additional risk, and we have a duty to protect them. So the redistribution, I think, has been so far partially successful. 250 million doses more have been distributed so far. That's not nothing. And also, they have often gone to countries who otherwise might not have a channel for doses. But the fact of the matter is you can't distribute doses that you don't have. And that's why it's so important to focus now on the assignment of doses to COVAX. It's a channel. And so the bottleneck is supply, and it's supply from manufacturers to COVAX. And so that's where our collective focus needs to be. And then, Mia, if you go to the next step, I think that's the immediate response that saves lives today, and therefore very important. I think the next step is the waiving of intellectual property, the sharing of technologies, know-how, recipes, the chef, because this is the way I think countries and regions can have trust that they will have supply in times of scarcity. If, for example, if there's a future variant or future pandemic and we have to start again, it's through that innovation that countries and regions gain self-reliance. And an appropriate balance between self-reliance and charity is important here, because charity is a wonderful thing, but charity alone, it may be necessary, but it's not sufficient to protect countries. And that's one of the hard lessons of this pandemic. So the failures of COVAX are actually the failures of us all. It's the failure of solidarity. It's the failure to allocate vaccines to the most vulnerable. It's the failures of human rights. And COVAX, in a sense, is a fishbowl or a test case for that. And so the focus of the Amnesty campaign on companies, on governments to share vaccines and technologies is exactly the right focus, even coming off the lessons from COVAX. Thank you, Mia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singer, and that is such an important point that you've raised, a lack of solidarity. And that links very well to one of the questions that we got, and that is from Chatham House. And I would like Mr. Chalil and Dr. Callamard to respond to it. Robert Yates is asking whether the fact that we have countries, wealthier countries, hoarding vaccines and destroying excess doses in the middle of a pandemic while many other countries don't even have access to vaccines for their most vulnerable, can that be classified as a crime against humanity? Dr. Callamard, you can start.
That's a challenging question. It's an interesting question. My position is, without going into crimes against humanity just now, the perspective on human rights obligation, or the conceptual basis for what determine obligations, are a mixture of control and capacities. Who has the capacity to protect rights? Who has sufficient control, either around a situation, a population, a territory, a company, to activate those capacities? This approach to human rights obligations is very well anchored in jurisprudence and in the legal thinking around human rights obligation. And when you look at the Western governments at the moment, there is absolutely no doubt that they both have control and capacities. They can control the companies, they can control what to do with their doses of vaccine in surplus, and they have the capacity to act on that control. They have the capacity to reach out to COVAX. They have the capacity to redistribute. They have the capacity to waive copyright through the WTO mechanisms. So the obligations of those governments in human rights terms, in my view, is directly involved at the moment. But allow me to go one step further. I am a strong believer that in the international system of the 21st century and 2021 and beyond, non-state actors too are crucial actors, particularly corporate actors. And there has been many steps taken, conceptually, legally, practically, to insist that corporate actors have human rights obligations. We may not always have the instrument to act on that obligation. We do not have an international court to try corporate actors, but in fact the ICC could do that. The ICC has the mandate to act on violations by non-state actors. So the thinking internationally is clearly going into the direction of holding corporate actors directly accountable for human rights obligations. And there too, those pharmaceutical companies have the capacities to act. They have in their fingertip, they have in their profit margin, they have in their direct resources, they have in their staff the capacity to deliver justice to the world population, and they are withdrawing that capacity. And it means millions are dying. So governments, but also pharmaceutical companies, in my view, are violating what I will say are human rights obligations to the right to life, to millions, billions of people around the world.
Thanks very much, Dr. Callamard. Mr. Chalil, a response from you: is the hoarding of vaccines and destroying of excess doses in wealthier countries a crime against humanity?
Yes, of course. As far as my understanding, I believe it's an injustice and it's a crime, because some countries and some pharmaceutical companies who are wealthy enough to hold everything are not supplying to the poor countries, so which is actually a crime, and it's an injustice. So countries like us, we are dependent to some of other people in case of manufacturing and the production. So like us, getting the vaccine were one of the toughest scenario. I think not giving a vaccine to the poorer people is an injustice, and totally it's a crime. That's what I thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And we have one last question. We've got time for one more question that I would like Dr. Singer to start off with a response, and then we can go to Mr. Chalil. It is a question that asks, why are the voices of leaders and governments in LDCs, or the least developed countries, not louder, calling for COVID-19 vaccines for protection of frontline healthcare workers and the most at-risk vulnerable population? And also, why are we not hearing more from the African Union in this regard? The person who asked the question says, let's hear the voices of the frontline healthcare workers and midwives as well. Dr. Singer?
Thank you. There's two important premises underlying that question. One is that the world needs to protect its health workers. Imagine spending years to build up primary health care in countries, and I'm talking about countries building their own primary health systems, and then having inadequate human resource, et cetera, and then having that destroyed and set back through this type of plague, where those health workers are dying because they are taking on risks to take care of their patients. That is the most unjust situation one can imagine. So the first thing I want to say, and WHO is very clear, that health workers are a very high priority for protection because they're very high risk. And Dr. Tedros has emphasized that throughout the pandemic. The second point I want to make that's underlying that question is that, in a sense, leadership is the most effective vaccine against the pandemic. But not only the pandemic, the conjoint global crises we face in climate, in racism, in economic inequality, leadership. You know, little known fact, there's at least a 50-fold difference in cumulative mortality among even G20 countries. So, you know, that has to do with some chance, that has to do with some factors, but leadership is very important, and it's leadership in the international system, and it's leadership in countries. And in countries, it's leadership from the very head of the government through to community leadership. And that's where I want to end on this, because pandemics start and end in communities. All of us can be leaders. Community leaders are critical to this, to ending this pandemic. And I was really taken by Agnes Callamard's remarks on complicity, which to me translates into the authenticity of what each of us can do. You know, just a very quick personal anecdote, if I may, Mia. I was offered the vaccine because I have some comorbidities early in 2021. And by the way, I had COVID in the spring of 2020, my wife and I, and thankfully it was mild. I decided to defer because that was at a time when many health workers in Africa did not have the vaccine. Not because I was so-called hesitant, I really wanted the vaccine, but because I thought it wasn't right. I spoke with my family, I spoke with my kids, and then I did subsequently have the vaccine, as many of my colleagues did defer, you know, when it was clear that there was vaccination of African health workers going on. That's just a tiny example, and I knew very well that that vaccine that I didn't take was not immediately going to a country in Africa. But the point I'm trying to make is not, you know, what a great example I am. The point I'm trying to make is each of us can have authenticity and reflect in very authentic ways, because in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, our grandchildren are going to ask us about this. They're going to ask what we did to prevent these counted 5 million deaths. It's probably twice or three times that amount. The biggest crisis probably in global health in 100 years. And so I want to highlight, thirdly, in addition to talking about the health workers, and in addition to talking about the importance of leadership, this question of authenticity. which is, I guess, the flip side of complicity. And each of us can do something. And the question is what each of us will do to end this gross injustice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singer. We have 2 minutes left of our event. Mr. Chalil, a very quick, short response from you. You, a healthcare worker, are the voices of healthcare workers heard loudly enough in your country, and are your leaders doing enough to make those voices heard?
That's a very, very interesting question, because you very, very clearly mentioned that the voices of the frontline workers are not really heard. It's just because we are representing from an unorganized sector wherein the maximum level of exploitation happening. I mean to say that now even the government do not have the count of nurses and doctors who lost their life due to COVID-19. This was the condition in our nation, which means our demands and our voices are not discussed or nor displayed anywhere in the globe. That's what I can tell you right now. Because we've been trying to identify a lot of issues and address to the ministry, to the administration. But somehow we were not able to do it just because of the superpower privatized people, like the private hospitals and the management. The unionism and the collective bargaining has been not allowed in our nation, or they feel that the unionization is a threat to the nation. So in that scenario, to talk about our issues, especially like nurses' issues or doctors' issues, it's pretty complicated when it comes to a worker like us. I mean, we as a union leaders, we were trying to address those issues to the government, but somehow they are not responding to our demands. So, for example, like we were demanding for the safety kits in the beginning time, but some of us have not given with the PPE kits and other safety equipments. And that's the reason many of our colleagues have lost their life due to COVID-19. So this is not just happening in India, but I feel some of other nations also are facing the similar issue. Not just nurses, even the midwife and other healthcare workers are having the same problem. I think that should be addressed with immediate effect, because they've been dealing with contagious diseases like COVID-19 and other things, and they're working in a highly risky area. So they should be protected, and their voice should be heard and discussed. That's my suggestion. Thank you.
Much, Mr. Chalil, and that then brings us to the end of our event. I'd like to thank our panelists for their time, for the sharing of their expertise and their valuable insights today. And I'd also like to again thank Argentina for being a co-sponsor of this Amnesty International event. If you'd like to access a recording of this webinar, you can do so shortly via Amnesty International's YouTube site, or you can also contact Anne Harrison. You can email her on ann.harrison, that is HARRISON, @amnesty.org. That concludes our event for today. Enjoy the rest of your day.